When people talk about the Trojan War, everyone remembers the giant wooden horse, a symbol of military cunning that allowed the Greeks to penetrate the impregnable city. However, behind this legend lies the figure of Odysseus, whose wit and cunning saved him more than once in far more personal and dangerous adventures. Today, we will delve into the myths to reveal Odysseus's ingenious deceptions, which are often overlooked, showing how his ingenuity helped him survive where strength was powerless. Subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and let's get started. The damp, musty air of the cave is saturated with the smell of unwashed bodies, sour milk, and fresh blood. The stone walls are oppressive, and the only exit is blocked by a boulder that even 100 warriors could not move. In the corner, by the light of a dying fire, a monster slumbers, Polyphemus, the Cyclops, son of Poseidon himself. His single eye is closed, and snores like distant thunder come from his huge mouth. Nearby lie the gnawed bones of 2 companions who became dinner for the giant. There is no hope. Strength is useless here. Pleas are ridiculous. It is in this atmosphere of absolute hopelessness that Odysseus's mind begins to work at a feverish pace. He realizes that simply killing the Cyclops in his sleep would be signing a death warrant for himself and his surviving companions. None of them would be able to roll the stone away from the entrance. The plan had to be more subtle, more complex. He had to make the monster destroy himself. The first step was psychological manipulation. When Polyphemus woke up and demanded the name of his captive, Odysseus, without batting an eyelid, said, "No one." In ancient Greek, euti. This simple word hides the whole essence of the coming deception. The Cyclops, seeing no trickery in the name, which seems simply strange to him, promises to eat nobody last. Such is his cruel gift to his guest. Next comes the preparation for action. Odysseus finds a huge log of wild olive wood in the cave, sharpens its end and burns it in the coals of the fire, hardening the wood to the hardness of metal. He waits for Polyphemus to return with his flock and drink undiluted wine again, which Odysseus has prudently offered him. When the Cyclops falls into a drunken sleep, the climax comes. Gathering the remaining men, Odysseus heats the tip in the fire until it is red hot, and, joining forces, they thrust it into the monster's only eye. The roar of the blinded giant shakes the cave. Polyphemus jumps up, pulling the smoking stake out of his eye socket, and begins to thrash about in agony, blindly trying to grab his tormentors. He screams, calling for help from the other Cyclopses living nearby. "Brothers, help! Nobody is destroying me," he cries. Hearing his call, his kinsmen rush to the cave and ask what has happened. Polyphemus's answer baffles them. Nobody is killing me. Nobody is destroying me with his strength. Deciding that Polyphemus had gone mad, or that the gods had sent a disease upon him, the Cyclopses disperse, advising him to pray to their father Poseidon. The trap has snapped shut. The name has become a weapon. But one last task remained, to get out of the cave. In the morning, the blinded Polyphemus moved the rock to let his flock out to pasture, but he sat at the entrance, feeling the backs of each ram and sheep so that the captives could not slip outside. And here Odysseus uses his final trick. He ties the sheep in 3s, and under the belly of the middle largest sheep he ties one of his men. He himself, choosing the largest and woolliest ram, the leader of the flock, clings to its thick wool from below. The blind Polyphemus carefully runs his hands over the animals' backs, but it does not occur to him to check what is underneath them. The plan worked perfectly. The island of Ea greeted the sailors with a deceptive silence. Soft singing could be heard from the depths of the forest, and the aroma of smoke from a hearth wafted through the air. The reconnaissance party sent by Odysseus discovered a beautiful palace made of hewn stone in a forest valley. Lions and wolves roamed around it, but they behaved strangely. They did not attack, but fawned on people like domestic dogs, wagging their tails. Inside the palace, a beautiful woman with golden hair, the sorceress Circe, or Circe, sat at a loom and sang. Enchanted by her beauty and hospitality, the sailors accepted her invitation to enter without hesitation. All except one, the cautious Eurylochus. Circe seated them at the table and treated them to cheese, honey, and Pramnian wine, into which she had mixed her magic potion. As soon as they had drained their cups, she touched each of them with her magic wand, and before the eyes of Eurylochus, who was lurking outside, his companions were transformed into pigs. Their bodies were covered with bristles, their faces stretched into snouts, but their minds remained human. They grunted and cried in the pigsty, realizing the horror of their situation. Upon learning of what had happened, Odysseus set out alone to rescue his men. He was heading for certain death, but suddenly a young man with a golden staff appeared on his path, the god Hermes, messenger of Olympus. He revealed Circe's secret to Odysseus and gave him an antidote, a magical plant called moly. It had a black root and a milky white flower, and only a god could pull it out of the ground. Hermes instructs the hero in detail. He must take Circe's potion, and when it has no effect, draw his sword as if he were going to kill her. Frightened, she will offer to share her bed with him, and this is where the main trick lies. Before agreeing, Odysseus must make her take a great oath to the gods, an unbreakable oath by the waters of the Styx, that she will not plot any new evil against him.
Odysseus's cunning here lies not in simply opposing magic, but in using the rules of the divine world itself against its inhabitants. He does not simply rely on magic herbs. He devises a multi-step combination where every move is calculated. He enters the palace, takes the cup from Circe's hands, and when she tries to turn him into a beast, the potion has no effect. He grabs his sword, and the sorceress, seeing that her spells are powerless, falls at his feet, recognizing him as the very Odysseus whose arrival she had been warned about. Following Hermes' instructions, he forces her to take an oath. This was a decisive moment. Without this oath, even if he shared her bed, he would remain vulnerable. But the oath, sealed with the name of the underground river Styx, was an absolute guarantee of safety, which neither mortal, god, nor even the powerful sorceress herself dared to break. Only then did he agree to her terms, and Circe restored his companions to human form. Deception, backed by divine assistance and knowledge of sacred laws, allowed him not only to avoid destruction, but also to turn a mortal enemy into a temporary ally. These two episodes show Odysseus not only as a brave warrior, but also as a master of psychology and a strategist capable of finding a way out of situations where brute force is doomed to failure. But where is the line that separates the hero's saving cunning from the cold calculation of a manipulator willing to use any means to achieve his goal? This line is blurred at the very moment when deception ceases to be a tool for survival and becomes a tool of power, even if that power is directed at saving those who follow you. Odysseus's next test, predicted by Circe, was just that. A test not so much of cunning as of leadership and willingness to pay a terrible price. It was about passing by the island of the Sirens. Myths depict them as half-bird, half-woman creatures whose voices are so beautiful that any sailor who hears them drops his oars, steers his ship onto the rocks, and perishes, and the shores of their island are littered with the bleached bones and dried skin of their victims. But the deceptive nature of the sirens was much deeper than simple acoustic seduction. Their song was not just a beautiful melody. It was a personalized promise, knowledge that everyone craved. To the warrior, they sang of his future glory and exploits. To the philosopher, of the mysteries of the universe. To the homesick, of peace and tranquility in their native lands. And to Odysseus, whose main quality was an inquisitive, insatiable mind, they promised knowledge of everything that happens on earth. They sang to him about his own exploits at Troy, flattering his vanity, and then offered to reveal all the secrets of the future to him. It was a temptation not for the ears, but for the intellect. Odysseus, knowing this, resorts to deception again, but this time the object of manipulation is twofold, his own crew and himself. He orders his men to plug their ears with beeswax so that they cannot hear a sound. It is a simple but effective measure. However, he chooses a different path for himself. He does not want to miss out on this unique experience. His curiosity outweighs his fear. He orders himself to be tied to the mast so tightly that he cannot move. And here comes the key command, the culmination of his psychological game with himself. If I beg you, if I order you to release me, you must tie me even tighter. He acknowledges his weakness in advance. He knows that his will, his mind, his very essence will be broken. And he creates a system in which his future orders, given under the influence of enchantment, are declared invalid in advance. It is a deception aimed at the future, insurance against himself.
When the ship drew level with the island and the siren's song began, everything happened as he had foreseen. His face contorted with desire. He screamed, struggled to break free, and signaled to his crew with his eyes and eyebrows, demanding, begging, ordering them to untie him. But the sailors, deaf to the singing and loyal to his first true order, only tightened the ropes. Odysseus got what he wanted, knowledge and experience, but survived only because he was able to outwit his own nature. However, this intellectual test was immediately followed by another, far more terrifying one, where cunning could no longer ensure a bloodless victory. The strait between Scylla and Charybdis. On one side was the monstrous whirlpool Charybdis, which sucked in and spewed out seawater along with ships 3 times a day. There was no chance of survival if you got caught in it. On the other side was the 6-headed Scylla, dwelling in a rock. Each of her 6 heads on a long neck could grab one sailor from the deck. Circe gave Odysseus clear and cruel advice. Better to sacrifice 6 than to lose everyone. And here Odysseus commits the darkest deception of his journey. He deceives his own crew. He tells them about the threat of Charybdis so that they row with all their might, keeping to the opposite shore. But he does not mention Scylla. He understands that if he tells the truth, his men will be paralyzed with fear. They would drop their oars, hide in the hold, and then the uncontrollable ship would inevitably be sucked into the whirlpool. He makes the decision for them, depriving them of choice, and consciously leads 6 of them to their deaths in order to save the rest. When they passed Charybdis, 6 serpentine necks suddenly shot out of the rock. Odysseus later recalled this moment as the most terrifying of his life. He heard his captured comrades scream, shouting his name for the last time. He saw them, still alive and struggling, being devoured by the monster at the entrance to its cave. And he could do nothing. His cunning saved the ship, but it also turned him into an executioner for part of his crew.
At this moment, Odysseus the trickster gives way to Odysseus the commander, who bears the full weight of moral responsibility for the decisions he has made. This deception brought him neither glory nor satisfaction, only bitterness and an awareness of the price of survival. But the greatest theater of a single actor, the pinnacle of his art of transformation and psychological warfare, unfolded on his native soil, in Ithaca. After 20 years of absence, he returns not as a victorious king, but as a nameless, ragged beggar, who, with the help of the goddess Athena, has changed his appearance beyond recognition. His home has been taken over by 100 insolent suitors, feasting on his possessions and forcing his wife Penelope to choose a new husband. To burst in with a sword drawn would be madness. He is alone against 100. He needs information. He needs to separate the loyal from the traitors. He needs the perfect moment to strike. And his beggar's robe becomes his best armor and weapon. Disguised as a poor old man, he enters his own house. He endures humiliation and beatings from the suitors, and even from his own traitorous servants. Every kick, every piece of bread thrown at him is a grain of information. He sees who is cruel, who is compassionate, who has remained loyal to the old master. The first test of loyalty comes when he meets the swineherd Eumaeus. Odysseus does not reveal himself to him, but instead composes a complex, detailed legend about himself. He is supposedly a noble Cretan, a participant in the Trojan War, who survived slavery and wanderings. This story is a masterpiece of disinformation. It is full of plausible geographical names and events, and skillfully weaves in hints about the real Odysseus to test his interlocutor. Eumaeus, listening to him, sighs about his lost master, showing unwavering loyalty. The test is passed. The most poignant moment of this masquerade is the scene at the palace gates. Argos, once the fastest and strongest dog in Ithaca, lies dying on a pile of manure. In 20 years, he has become an old, sick dog covered in parasites. But even through the magical gloom of Athena and the rags of a beggar, he recognizes the smell of his master. He does not even have the strength to get up. He just wags his tail and lowers his ears. Odysseus, seeing this, secretly wipes away a tear, but cannot approach so as not to give himself away. Argos, having fulfilled his last duty, waiting for his master, dies. This scene is the only one during his entire disguise where pure instinctive recognition takes place, free from human deception and doubt. The culmination of the psychological duel is his conversation with Penelope. Tormented by doubts, she decides to talk to the mysterious stranger who, according to rumors, may have seen her husband. Odysseus continues to play his role, repeating the Cretan legend. But to win her trust, he makes a brilliant move. He describes the clothes in which he allegedly saw Odysseus 20 years ago. He mentions a purple wool cloak and a gold clasp depicting a dog holding a spotted deer in its paws. It was such an accurate and intimate detail, known only to her and him, that Penelope burst into tears. He causes her pain to ensure her loyalty and prepare her for the events to come. He plays on her deepest feelings like the strings of a lyre, while remaining the ruthless director of his own play. Even when his old nurse Euryclea, washing his feet, recognizes him by touch from an old scar left by a boar's tusks, he does not let his plan fall apart. With one hand he covers her mouth, with the other he pulls her towards him and whispers a threat to kill even her, his nurse, if she betrays him. This shows how high the stakes were. His deception was total, allowing for no mistakes, no sentimentality. And finally, the denouement. Penelope, perhaps already guessing everything, announces a test to the suitors. Whoever can draw the string of Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads will become her husband. It was not just a contest, it was a death sentence disguised as a wedding competition. The suitors, confident and drunk, fail one after another. They cannot even bend the shaft. And then a poor old man asks to try. Amidst the laughter and mockery of the crowd, he takes the bow in his hands, easily draws the string, which sings under his fingers, and sends the arrow straight to the target on his first try. In the next second, he throws off his rags. The masquerade is over. The slaughter begins. The bow, which was a tool of testing, becomes an instrument of revenge. His long deception was only a prelude to this moment. He gathered all his enemies in one place, unarmed, locked in the hall, and methodically, cold-bloodedly destroyed them all. Even after this bloody victory, one last test of cunning awaited him, but this time he was being tested. Penelope, to make absolutely sure that it was really her husband and not a god in his guise, says to the maid, "Take his bed out of our bedroom. Let him sleep on it." Odysseus explodes with rage. "Woman, who dared to move my bed? I carved it myself from the trunk of a living olive tree that grew right in the courtyard, and only then built the walls of the bedroom around it. It is impossible to move it from its place." It was their secret. Only then does Penelope, weeping, throw herself into his arms. His latest deception has been revealed by her own deception. The circle is complete. The cunning Odysseus has met his match in the cunning Penelope. His odyssey of deception, which began with tricks on the battlefield and continued in battles with monsters, ended with a subtle psychological game with the person closest to him, proving that his true kingdom was not rocky Ithaca, but the boundless labyrinths of the human mind. But the origins of this total mimicry, this transformation of his entire life into a strategic game, lie even before his ship left the shores of Ithaca, heading for Troy. His very first great deception was directed not at monsters or enemies, but at his own allies. When Menelaus and Agamemnon summoned the Greek kings to march against Helen, Odysseus, whom the oracle had predicted would wander for 20 years and return alone, was not at all eager to participate in someone else's war. He had just found a family, his wife Penelope and his newborn son Telemachus. And then he staged what was perhaps the most desperate performance of his life. He pretended to be mad. When the envoys arrived in Ithaca, they found the king engaged in an absurd activity. He had harnessed a bull and a donkey to a plow and was sowing salt on the fertile field by the sea. It was a pantomime of madness designed to have him declared unfit for military service. However, among the envoys was Palamedes, a hero who was as cunning as Odysseus. He saw through the ruse. Without saying a word, he took the infant Telemachus from Penelope's arms and placed him directly in front of the plow. The calculation was precise and ruthless. A true madman would not have paid attention to the child. But Odysseus, seeing his son in the path of the plow, stopped the team abruptly. The performance failed. His mind was exposed by his own paternal love. This episode is important not only as an example of early cunning, but also as a demonstration of its limits. It showed that Odysseus had a vulnerability, and that there were minds in the world capable of calculating his moves. His hidden enmity towards Palamedes, who had outplayed him, would later lead to tragedy. At Troy, Odysseus would take revenge by planting a fake letter from the Trojans and gold on Palamedes, framing him for treason and securing his execution. Thus, a saving ruse, once it failed, was reborn as a deadly intrigue, proving that intellect without moral restraints becomes a terrible weapon. This innate talent for manipulating reality finds its highest expression not only in actions but also in words. When Odysseus, shipwrecked and washed ashore on Shacaria, arrives at the palace of King Alcinous, he appears before the Phaeacians not simply as a storyteller, but as the director of his own legend. His multi-day account of his travels is not an impartial chronicle of events, but a carefully calibrated PR project.
He glosses over his mistakes, presenting himself exclusively as a victim of the wrath of the gods and the cruelty of fate. He describes with relish how he blinded Polyphemus, but tactfully omits a key detail. Already sailing away to a safe distance, he, overcome with pride, could not resist shouting his real name to the Cyclops. It was this act of vanity, not the blinding itself, that incurred Poseidon's wrath and was the root cause of all his subsequent misfortunes. In his version for the Phaeacians, this moment is smoothed over, presented as a just response to the monster's treachery. He tells of the death of his companions on the island of the god Helios, who ate the sacred bulls, but presents it as if he alone tried to stop them, even though his leadership qualities proved powerless at that moment. He weaves a web of truth and omissions, creating the image of a tragic hero worthy of sympathy and, most importantly, help. His listeners, captivated by the drama of the narrative, equip a ship for him and shower him with gifts that exceed the value of all his trophies. Odysseus uses his most powerful tool here, narrative.
He understands that the story people hear is more important than the reality that happened. He did not just survive adventures, he turned them into a myth and himself into its central character. And this myth worked as a key that opened the way home for him. But even this masterclass in managing impressions pales in comparison to the psychological depth of his transformation into a beggar on Ithaca. This is not just a disguise, it is a descent to the very bottom of social existence, a voluntary acceptance of the role of an outcast in his own kingdom. Every day spent in this guise was torture for him, requiring superhuman self-control. He, the king, accustomed to honor, was forced to beg for scraps from his own table. He, the husband, saw other men harass his wife and had to endure it in silence. The greatest test of his willpower did not occur in battle or in a dispute with the gods, but in a quiet scene when he sat on the threshold listening to the song of the blind bard Demodocus, who sang of the exploits of the heroes at Troy, including him, Odysseus. He listened to the story of his glory, being a nobody, and was forced to hide his face in rags to hide the tears rolling down his cheeks. It was a war raging within himself, a war between his true nature and the role he was forced to play. Every blow he received from Antinous, every mockery, was not just humiliation, but a test of his endurance. He had to not only look old and weak, he had to become old and weak, suppressing any urge for revenge until the appointed hour. It was not a momentary trick, but a long, exhausting siege of his own soul. He stored up his anger like a warrior sharpens his sword, knowing that a premature strike would lead to defeat. And when he finally took up his bow, it was not just an act of revenge, it was an act of liberation, not only of Ithaca from its invaders, but also of himself from the shackles of the personality he had carried for so long and so painfully. It was a war raging within himself, a war between his true nature and the role he was forced to play. Every blow he received from Antinous, every mockery, was not just humiliation, but a test of his endurance. He had to not only look old and weak, he had to become old and weak, suppressing any urge for revenge until the appointed hour. It was not a momentary trick, but a long, exhausting siege of his own soul. He stored up his anger like a warrior sharpens his sword, knowing that a premature strike would lead to defeat. And when he finally took up his bow, it was not just an act of revenge, it was an act of liberation, not only of Ithaca from its invaders, but also of himself from the shackles of the personality he had carried for so long and so painfully. This habit of deception, which had become second nature, permeated his entire being to such an extent that at times it seemed as if he could no longer act otherwise. Even when the main goal was achieved, when the enemies were defeated and the house was liberated, he was in no hurry to drop the mask. His last, most mysterious, and perhaps most cruel deception takes place at the end of the poem, when he meets his own father. He finds old Laertes in the garden, dressed in rags, grieving and aged by the sorrow of his lost son. Instead of immediately embracing him and offering comfort, Odysseus starts another game. He again introduces himself as a stranger, a Cretan, and begins to question the old man about his son, claiming that he once hosted Odysseus in his home. He describes their fictional encounters in detail, watching as each word pierces the father's heart like a knife. Laertes listens to him, and a black melancholy overwhelms him with renewed force. He scoops up a handful of dust and sprinkles it on his gray head. Only when he sees this abyss of despair does Odysseus finally break down, rush to him, embrace him, and reveal himself, presenting the scar on his leg as proof. Why was this painful prelude necessary? Interpreters have been arguing about this for centuries. Perhaps it was a final, almost paranoid check to make sure that his father was not involved with the suitors. Perhaps it was a clumsy way of preparing the old man for the shocking news, dosing him with information. Or perhaps, and this is the most disturbing version, Odysseus, having lived 20 years in a world where lying was synonymous with life, simply forgot how to tell the truth. Deception became for him not a tool, but the only known means of communication, a reflex that kicks in automatically even when there is no need for it.
In this final scene, we see not so much a cunning hero as a man forever changed by his Odyssey, for whom the journey home was not a return to his former self, but a final affirmation of a new, complex, and tragic identity as an eternal wanderer in a world of illusions. This cunning was not simply an acquired skill forged in the crucible of war and wandering. It ran in his blood, inherited from his maternal grandfather, Autolycus, whom the god Hermes himself had endowed with the gift of thievery and perjury. But while Autolycus was a master of selfish deception, Odysseus elevated this talent to the rank of strategic art, where the goal was not enrichment, but the survival of civilization. The most striking example of such cold pragmatism is the story of Philoctetes. This unfortunate hero, owner of Heracles' bow, was unceremoniously abandoned by the Greeks on the island of Lemnos at the beginning of the campaign because of a festering wound on his leg that exuded an unbearable stench. For 10 years he survived alone, harboring hatred for his former comrades. But then a prophecy declared that Troy could not be taken without Philoctetes' bow. And who was sent on this virtually impossible mission? To convince or deceive the embittered cripple? Odysseus, of course. He took with him the young Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, counting on his honesty and youth. Odysseus' plan is cynical to the extreme. Neoptolemus must pretend that he too is offended by the Greek leaders, gain Philoctetes' trust, and lure the bow from him. For Odysseus, the feelings of an abandoned ally are just a variable in the equation of victory. When Neoptolemus, shaken by Philoctetes' suffering, hesitates and is ready to reveal the truth, Odysseus harshly cuts him off, ready to use force. There are no monsters or sorceresses in this drama, only cruel necessity and a man ready to manipulate the despair of his abandoned comrade for the sake of a common goal. He demonstrated the same ruthless calculation under the walls of Troy, acting as commander of a special forces unit. His famous night raid with Diomedes into the Trojan camp was not a nightly duel, but an exemplary diversionary operation. First, they capture the Trojan spy Dolon, who, under torture or in exchange for a false promise of life, reveals the location of the Thracian king Rhesus, an ally of the Trojans. This is followed by a silent infiltration into the sleeping camp. Odysseus does not simply kill Rhesus and his 12 bodyguards, he does so with surgical precision, while Diomedes unties the king's magical horses, which, according to legend, would have ensured Troy's invincibility if they had managed to drink water from the river Scamander. Here, deception is disguise, misinformation, and surprise. He does not wait for the enemy to come to him. He penetrates his heart himself and cuts out the threat while he sleeps. This operation is the quintessence of his military genius, not a clash of armies, but a pinpoint strike that changes the course of the entire campaign. Even his masquerade on Ithaca was filled with similar micro-operations, where every gesture was calculated. Take, for example, his clash with the local beggar bully Eros, who considered the palace porch his territory. For the suitors, it was entertainment, an excuse to stage a mock fight between two ragged men, promising the winner the best piece of meat. But for Odysseus, it was a strategic necessity. He could not allow another alpha male among the beggars to challenge his right to be at the threshold. He needed to assert his status without revealing his true strength, and he does so with brilliant precision. First, he slightly lifts his rags, revealing his powerful thighs and shoulders, which terrifies Hera. Then, in the fight, he delivers a single, perfectly calculated blow to the jaw, which does not kill, but leaves no doubt about his superiority.
He breaks Ira's jaw and drags him away from the courtyard, becoming the undisputed king of beggars. This accomplishes several goals at once. It secures him unhindered access to the palace, sends a subtle but threatening signal to the most perceptive of the suitors and servants, and, not least, gets him the promised dinner. It was not a fight, but a performance in which he was the director, the main actor, and the audience member evaluating the reaction of the hall. He had honed his skills as a secret agent operating behind enemy lines long before returning home. Together with Diomedes, he carried out a daring theft of the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena that served as Troy's talisman of invincibility. Sneaking into the city under cover of night, they carried off the sacred object, thereby not only stealing the artifact, but also breaking the morale of the defenders, depriving them of divine protection. But even before that, he had single-handedly carried out an operation that became a rehearsal for his Ithacan masquerade. Having disfigured himself beyond recognition and disguised himself as a slave, he infiltrated Troy to gather intelligence. There, in the heart of the enemy capital, only Helen recognized him. But for reasons that the myths do not reveal, she did not betray him, allowing him to gather information about the weak points in the defenses and return safely to the Greek camp. However, Odysseus's most destructive deception was directed not at his enemies, but at his comrade in arms. After the death of Achilles, his armor was to go to the most worthy of the Greeks. The main contenders were Ajax the Great, a mighty warrior, and Odysseus. The dispute was decided not by force of arms, but by force of words. In his speech, Odysseus belittled Ajax's exploits, presenting them as a manifestation of crude, thoughtless force, while he presented his own merits, espionage, sabotage, strategy, as the true guarantee of victory. He convinced the judges that the mind of the strategist who stole the Palladium was more valuable than the blind fury of a warrior. This verbal manipulation, this triumph of rhetoric over valor, drove Ajax mad and ultimately led to his suicide. Here, Odysseus's cunning is no longer a saving grace, but a poisonous blade capable of destroying even the greatest hero. The stories about Odysseus remind us that his genius for deception was not a random trick, but a well-thought-out strategy that saved him in critical situations. From his escape from the Cyclops to his return to Ithaca, each episode emphasizes that intelligence and ingenuity are often more important than brute force. These myths, although not historical facts, continue to inspire us, teaching us that in life, as in legends, sometimes the most effective weapon is cunning.